Robert Mitchum looked like the easiest man in Hollywood. Half-closed eyes, a voice that sounded like it had been dragged over gravel and left in the sun. He could walk into any scene and make every other actor look like they were working too hard. But before Hollywood decided he was a movie star, Robert Mitchum had already lived a life that sounded less like a biography and more like a crime novel. He'd left home as a teenager. He'd wandered. He'd been arrested. He'd spent time on a chain gang in Georgia. And somehow, the same young man who'd escaped from forced labor would eventually become one of the most recognizable faces in American cinema. Then, just as his career was accelerating, he was arrested again. This time, the whole country was watching. Hollywood expected the scandal to end him. It didn't. And that was only the beginning of the story that didn't make sense. Because Robert Mitchum didn't just survive. He became something Hollywood couldn't quite explain. A leading man who didn't behave like one. A villain who barely had to raise his voice. An actor who appeared almost completely indifferent to the fact that he was famous. The strangest thing about Mitchum's life isn't any single incident. It's that nearly everything about him contradicted what a movie star was supposed to be. Robert Mitchum was born on August 6, 1917 in Bridgeport, Connecticut. His father, James, was a railroad worker. He was killed in a rail yard accident in Charleston, South Carolina before Robert's second birthday. His mother, Anne, a Norwegian immigrant, was pregnant with a third child at the time. She was awarded a government pension. She moved the family back to Connecticut and eventually remarried. Young Robert was trouble almost immediately. He fought. He got expelled. His mother sent him to live with his grandparents in Delaware. He was expelled again, reportedly for getting into a physical confrontation with a school principal. By the time he was in his early teens, he was done with classrooms entirely. He left. He rode freight trains during the Depression, one of the thousands of young men the era called wild boys of the road. He drifted across the country, picking up work wherever he could find it. He dug ditches. He worked for the Civilian Conservation Corps. He boxed professionally, which is where the broken nose came from. He slept in boxcars and woke up in towns he hadn't planned to visit. None of this was romantic. This was the 1930s, and Robert Mitchum was a teenager with no money, no address, and no particular destination. He drank, he smoked, he picked fights. Years later, when an interviewer asked Dick Cavett style whether he'd been a troubled youth, Mitchum didn't bother softening it. He'd been expelled from school so many times he'd stopped counting. One incident reportedly involved the trombone. He never explained what that meant. Could you picture this kid becoming one of the most famous actors in the world? Neither could anyone else. But the wandering wasn't just a rough chapter. One stop along the road would land him in a place that no future movie star was ever supposed to see from the inside. He was 14 years old, some accounts say 16. He was in Savannah, Georgia with nothing on him. The charge was vagrancy. The sentence was a chain gang. A chain gang. In the 1930s American South. Mitchum didn't talk about it often in specific terms, but the broad facts were never in dispute. He was arrested, he was put to work, and according to his own account, he escaped. He got himself onto a train and got out. He went back to the road, back to the drifting, back to the kind of life that had no visible future in it. What kind of person comes out of that experience? What does it do to a teenager to learn, before he's old enough to vote, that the system doesn't care whether he exists? The answer, in Mitchum's case, was something Hollywood wouldn't fully understand for decades. It produced a man who genuinely did not seem impressed by authority. Not as a pose, not as rebellion for its own sake. He'd already seen the worst that playing by the rules could offer, and he'd walked away from it, literally. A decade later, Hollywood would be paying that man to pretend to be dangerous. The difference was that Mitchum didn't have to pretend very hard. But he didn't enter movies because he'd always dreamed of acting. The whole thing happened almost by accident. His sister Julie had moved to Long Beach, California, hoping to break into movies. Robert followed her out in 1936. The rest of the Mitchum family eventually joined them there. He picked up odd jobs. He ghost wrote horoscope columns for an astrologer named Carol Ryder. Julie convinced him to join the Players Guild of Long Beach, where he worked as a stagehand and occasional bit player. He wrote short pieces that the guild performed. He even put a talent for poetry to work, writing song lyrics and monologues for his sister's nightclub act. Think about that for a second. The future Hollywood tough guy was writing poetry and horoscopes. None of this was a career plan. It was survival that happened to involve a stage. In 1940, he went back east to marry his sweetheart, Dorothy Spence, whom he'd met during his wandering years in Delaware. He brought her to California. When their first child arrived, he tried to settle down and took a steady job as a machine operator at the Lockheed Aircraft Corporation. It didn't last. The monotony pushed him back toward acting. But Mitchum had something. People who saw him noticed it. He had a physical presence that was difficult to ignore. He was tall. He was built like a boxer, which he had been. And there was something in his face that the camera would eventually find irresistible. A stillness, a quality that suggested he knew something he wasn't telling you. In the early 1940s, he started getting small film roles, westerns mostly, the Hopalong Cassidy series. He worked steadily, one of dozens of young men cycling through Hollywood's lower ranks, none of them guaranteed to last. Then came the role that changed everything. In 1945, William Wellman cast him in The Story of G.I. Joe, a war film based on the columns of the legendary correspondent Ernie Pyle. Mitchum played Lieutenant Bill Walker, a battle-weary infantry captain leading men through the Italian campaign. The film was nominated for 4 Academy Awards. One of those nominations was for Mitchum, Best Supporting Actor. It was his only Oscar nomination. He'd never receive another one. But the nomination did something more important than winning would have. It told Hollywood that the drifter from the freight trains could carry a movie. How does someone who never followed a single conventional rule end up being exactly the kind of man Hollywood wants to put on screen? That contradiction would define his entire career. And then Hollywood discovered his real weapon. It wasn't volume. It wasn't intensity. It wasn't charisma in the conventional sense. Mitchum's power on screen came from what he didn't do. He underplayed, radically. While other actors of his generation were reaching for emotion, projecting, filling every frame with effort, Mitchum pulled back. He did less, and somehow the audience felt more. His voice was low and unhurried. His movements were minimal. His eyes, those famous half-closed eyes, gave away almost nothing. You had to lean in, you had to watch him, and the moment you started watching Mitchum, you couldn't stop. In 1947, Jacques Tourneur cast him as Jeff Bailey in Out of the Past. It became one of the defining films of the noir era. Mitchum played a former private detective, dragged back into a world of betrayal by a gangster and a woman he should have walked away from. The character knew he was doomed. Mitchum played the doom like a man who'd already accepted the punchline of a bad joke and was simply waiting for the room to catch up. One review described his style as having the build of a boxer and the eyes of a poet. That captured it precisely. He didn't sell you the emotion, he let you find it yourself. Most actors wanted you to see what their character was feeling. Mitchum made you wonder. The film co-starred Kirk Douglas as the gangster and Jane Greer as the femme fatale. Both were excellent, but it was Mitchum who defined what the movie became. His Jeff Bailey is a man who knows he's walking into a trap and walks in anyway. Not because he's brave, but because he's already accepted that the trap is the story. When Greer's character lies to him, you can see that he knows she's lying. He just doesn't care enough to stop. Out of the Past established his persona, the solitary man, the quiet anti-hero, the figure who moved through a corrupt world with a kind of weary grace that suggested he'd already measured everything in it and found it wanting. It wasn't an act, or if it was built from something real, something learned on freight trains and chain gangs and long nights in places where nobody knew his name. Roger Ebert, who would eventually call Mitchum his favorite movie star, described him as someone who affected a weary indifference to his work. That's the key word, affected. Because underneath the indifference was craft, serious, disciplined, invisible craft. And then, at the exact moment his career was accelerating, Mitchum's real life became more dramatic than anything he'd played on screen. On September 1st, 1948, police burst through the door of a cottage in Laurel Canyon. Inside, Robert Mitchum and actress Lila Leeds were smoking marijuana with 2 others. The arrest was part of a sting operation targeting Hollywood figures. Several other actors and actresses had reportedly been tipped off about the operation. Mitchum and Leeds had not. The setup was suspicious from the start. A man named Robin Ford, whom Mitchum had met only weeks earlier, had insisted they stop at Leeds' cottage that evening. By the time Mitchum reached the police station, reporters and photographers were already waiting. The LAPD held a press conference. A narcotics sergeant told the papers the department intended to clean the dope users out of Hollywood. They didn't care who they had to arrest. Mitchum reportedly said it was the bitter end of everything. His career, his marriage, everything. He was charged with possession. He spent a week in county jail, then 43 days at a prison farm in Castaic, California. Life magazine sent photographers. They captured him mopping floors in a prison uniform. When a reporter asked him what jail was like, he said it was like Palm Springs without the riffraff. Another time, he said it was like Hollywood, but with a better class of people. This was 1948. The studio system was still in full command. Morals clauses governed contracts. An arrest like this was supposed to be a career death sentence. RKO, his studio, considered dropping him. The White House reportedly banned his films from being screened there. Every rule of Hollywood survival said Robert Mitchum was finished. But something strange happened. His next film, Rachel and the Stranger, was already in theaters. It performed well. Audiences didn't abandon him. If anything, the publicity made them more curious. The arrest hadn't made Mitchum less interesting, it had made him more interesting. He was the man who'd done the thing you weren't supposed to do and hadn't bothered to apologize for it. RKO, guided partly by Howard Hughes, chose to stand by him. The studio recognized what the audience already understood. Mitchum's appeal wasn't built on the illusion of perfection. It was built on the opposite. He was the star who seemed real. And the arrest itself turned out to be something more complicated than it first appeared. In January 1951, the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office reopened the case. After investigation, Mitchum's conviction was overturned. The raid had been a setup, engineered in part by the LAPD to generate publicity for its anti-narcotics campaign. Mitchum had been targeted. The whole thing had been orchestrated. The man who'd told reporters he expected the arrest to end everything had been right about one thing. He'd always suspected it was a frame. It took the legal system 3 years to confirm what he'd felt in the moment. Robert Mitchum had discovered something that most actors spend their entire careers trying to learn. The public didn't just tolerate his flaws, they were drawn to them. That discovery shaped everything that followed. Most movie stars of Mitchum's era worked hard to maintain an image. They cooperated with publicists. They attended the right events. They said the right things in interviews. Mitchum did none of this. He gave interviews that sounded like a man daring the reporter to be interested. He described his own acting as having two styles, one on a horse and one off it. He told people he had 3 expressions: looking left, looking right, and looking straight ahead. He once described acting as the simplest job in the world. You read a script, he said. If you like the part and the money's okay, you do it. Then you remember your lines, show up on time, and do what the director tells you. That's it. He married Dorothy Spence in 1940 and stayed with her for the rest of his life. He raised 3 children. People who worked with him described him as generous and professional on set, the opposite of the public image he cultivated. He read constantly. He wrote poetry. He had a photographic memory and could recite Shakespeare from recall. The man who told reporters he'd never changed anything but his underwear was quietly one of the most well-read people in Hollywood. Was he genuinely indifferent to fame? Or was the indifference itself the most sophisticated performance of his career? That question has no clean answer. But it's the question that makes Mitchum more interesting than almost any other star of his era. Because the man who claimed not to care about acting was also the man who could do this. In 1955, Charles Laughton directed his first and only film, The Night of the Hunter. It was based on a novel by Davis Grubb, and it told the story of 2 children fleeing a murderous false preacher named Harry Powell. Laughton needed someone who could make a monster feel charming, someone whose physical stillness could carry menace without volume. He considered Gary Cooper. Cooper turned it down, afraid the role would damage his career. Then Mitchum read for the part. Laughton described the character as a diabolical figure. Mitchum's response was immediate and perfect. He understood the character instantly, and he brought something Laughton hadn't expected: a dangerous sexuality. A warmth that made the horror worse, because you could see exactly how Powell's victims would fall for him. Laughton cast him. Mitchum's Powell is one of the most frightening characters in the history of American cinema. He's a con man dressed as a man of God, with love tattooed on one hand and hate on the other. He sings hymns while hunting children. He uses scripture the way other villains use weapons. And the most unsettling thing about him is how calm he is. Powell doesn't rage. He doesn't shout. He radiates a kind of patient, smiling evil that makes you understand why people trusted him. That's the horror. You'd trust him too. Lawton would later describe Mitchum as one of the best actors in the world. He called him tender. He called him a gentleman. This from the director who'd watched Mitchum inhabit a character so frightening that audiences in 1955 didn't know what to make of it. The film was a commercial failure when it came out. Lawton never directed again, but decades of reassessment turned The Night of the Hunter into a recognized masterpiece, and Mitchum's performance into one of the most studied villain portrayals ever committed to film. The most frightening man in the movie didn't need to shout, he just needed to smile. And if Powell was terrifying because Mitchum could disappear into a theatrical kind of evil, his next great villain was terrifying for a completely different reason. In 1962, Gregory Peck produced Cape Fear. He cast himself as a small-town lawyer, and he cast Robert Mitchum as Max Cady. Cady is an ex-convict who's done 8 years for sexual assault. He comes out of prison with one goal: to destroy the family of the man who put him there. He knows the law, he knows how far he can push it, and he pushes it with a grinning, physical menace that makes every scene feel like something terrible is about to happen in the next 30 seconds. Where Harry Powell was theatrical evil, a fairy tale monster in a preacher's suit, Max Cady was human evil, calculated, patient, intelligent enough to stay just inside the law while making his intentions absolutely clear. Mitchum didn't play Cady as a madman. He played him as someone who had thought carefully about exactly what he wanted to do and was enjoying the anticipation. The director, J. Lee Thompson, described Mitchum's approach simply. He said the actor was always ready to explode. That readiness, that coiled potential, is what makes the performance last. You never see Cady lose control. You just see a man who could lose control at any moment and has chosen not to. Yet. There's a detail about the production that's worth pausing on. Cape Fear was partially filmed in Savannah, Georgia, the same city where a teenage Robert Mitchum had been arrested for vagrancy and sentenced to a chain gang. He was reportedly reluctant to return. The man playing an ex-convict had personal reasons to avoid the location. The irony wasn't lost on him. Both Mitchum and Peck would later appear in the 1991 Scorsese remake, playing different roles. But it's Mitchum's original Cady that still defines the character. Robert De Niro's version was louder, more theatrical, more overtly unhinged. Mitchum's was quieter, and quieter turned out to be worse. But Mitchum's greatest trick wasn't playing villains. It was the fact that the same man could play almost anything. He did westerns, El Dorado alongside John Wayne. He did war films, The Longest Day. He did romance, Heaven Knows Mr. Allison, where he played a Marine stranded on a Pacific island with a nun played by Deborah Kerr. The film earned Kerr an Oscar nomination. Mitchum received none, despite a performance of enormous restraint and emotional precision. He did drama, Ryan's Daughter, David Lean's 3-hour epic set in Ireland. He did crime, The Friends of Eddie Coyle, one of the greatest American crime films of the 1970s, where he played a low-level informant facing impossible choices with the kind of worn-down authenticity that made the entire movie feel like a documentary. The man remembered as Hollywood's ultimate tough guy was far more versatile than the reputation suggested. He appeared in over 125 films across a 55-year career. He's ranked 23rd on the American Film Institute's list of the greatest male screen legends. Roger Ebert called him his favorite movie star. So why did Hollywood keep selling him as the same kind of man? This is the part of the story that most people don't consider. Mitchum's greatest strength became a limitation. He was so convincing as the dangerous, cool, mysterious leading man that the industry kept giving him versions of the same role. Dangerous in a different setting, cool in a different decade, mysterious in a different genre, but always recognizable. Always Mitchum. He knew it. He felt it. He once said he believed he had more to offer than what he was given. More tenderness, more range. But the machine that creates movie stars isn't designed to let them evolve. It's designed to repeat what already works. And what worked with Mitchum was the image, the heavy eyes, the low voice, the sense that this man had already seen the worst the world could show him and had decided not to be particularly bothered by it. The irony is that the quality that made him irreplaceable on screen was the same quality that kept him from being fully appreciated. He didn't lack talent, He was trapped by the fact that his talent was so immediately recognizable that nobody thought to ask what else was behind it. Most stars of Mitchum's generation disappeared when Hollywood changed. The studio system collapsed. Television arrived. New kinds of actors, method actors, intense and openly emotional, took over the screen. The old guard faded. Mitchum adapted. In the 1970s, young directors who'd grown up watching him in darkened theaters now had the power to cast him in their own films. Peter Yates put him in The Friends of Eddie Coyle, a Boston crime story that gave Mitchum one of the richest roles of his career. He played Philip Marlowe in Farewell My Lovely, channeling Raymond Chandler's detective with the seen-it-all wariness that only an actor in his late 50s could bring to the character. He starred in The Yakuza for Sidney Pollack. He still carried the authority that the camera had found in him 3 decades earlier, only now it was weathered instead of polished. The edges were softer, the weight was heavier, and somehow that made the performances better. Then television gave him a second act nobody had predicted. In 1983, he starred in The Winds of War, a massive miniseries based on Herman Wouk's novel about the events leading to American entry into World War II. He played Naval Officer Pug Henry, a role that demanded gravitas and emotional range across 18 hours of television. When it aired, it became the most-watched miniseries in American television history at the time. He reprised the role in War and Remembrance 5 years later. In 1991, the National Board of Review presented him with a Lifetime Achievement Award. The following year, he received the Cecil B. DeMille Award from the Golden Globes. These were the kinds of honors that Hollywood gives to people it has finally decided to take seriously. Mitchum accepted them the way he accepted everything else, without visible fuss. The man who'd started as a bit player in Hopalong Cassidy westerns was now the star of the biggest thing on television and the recipient of career recognition awards. 5 decades into a career that started by accident, he was still working, still commanding a screen, still making it look easy. His final film role came in 1995. Jim Jarmusch cast him in Dead Man, a strange black-and-white acid western starring Johnny Depp. Mitchum played John Dickinson, a ruthless factory owner in a frontier town. He appeared in one scene. It was enough. In that single scene, you could see the entire weight of a career, the authority, the menace, the stillness. The feeling that this man had been doing this longer than anyone in the room and didn't need to prove it. 2 years later, on July 1st, 1997, Robert Mitchum died in Santa Barbara, California. Lung cancer and emphysema. He was 79, a lifelong heavy smoker. He died 1 day before James Stewart. His body was cremated. His ashes were scattered at sea. He had spent 5 decades building a screen identity that Hollywood could never quite categorize. A chain gang prisoner who became an Academy Award nominee, a scandal-plagued actor whose career got stronger after the scandal, a leading man who didn't look like a leading man and didn't behave like one either, a villain who barely needed to move, an actor who claimed he had 3 expressions and then delivered performances that film scholars are still studying 70 years later. He told interviewers he'd never changed anything but his underwear. He told them his acting career added up to $1 million worth of horse manure because he'd spent it all on a farm. He told them the only difference between him and his fellow actors was that he'd spent more time in jail. And underneath all of that, underneath the jokes and the indifference and the half-closed eyes, there was something the camera always saw even when Mitchum pretended it wasn't there. A genuine and unsettling depth. A man who could write poetry and knock a man unconscious. A man who could play a monster and then walk off set and be, by all accounts, kind to the crew. A man who recorded a Calypso album for Capitol Records in 1957, not as a novelty stunt, but because he wanted to. A man who stayed married to the same woman for 57 years while playing the most dangerous men on screen. Robert Mitchum wasn't Hollywood's rebel because he was constantly trying to shock people. He became Hollywood's rebel because he seemed completely unwilling to pretend that being a movie star was a big deal. And that, more than the chain gang, more than the arrest, more than the villains, is what made him impossible to ignore. Robert Mitchum didn't spend his life trying to convince Hollywood that he was a movie star. He seemed almost amused that Hollywood had decided he was one. And maybe that's the reason his image lasted longer than almost anyone from his generation. Everyone else was working to become something. Mitchum just seemed to be Mitchum. Hollywood spent 50 years trying to turn him into a legend. The strange part is that he never seemed particularly interested in becoming one. But he became one anyway, and the legend, like the man, never bothered to explain itself.